The Springbok Tour of Protests of 1981 is a controversial event as it invited global change in race relations, bringing the world, but most of all, New Zealand and South Africa into a new era. This event is highly significant to the history of New Zealand because of its controversy and how it evoked change. At the time, Prime Minister of New Zealand Robert Muldoon was reluctant to get involved with the tour, which had a huge effect on New Zealand's reputation among other countries. The tour had many consequences, including physical damage caused by protesters fighting rugby supporters and police, change in the New Zealand government, and the resulting collapse of apartheid in South Africa. The number one cause of the protests in South Africa throughout the Springboks tour of 1981 was apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid is the number one cause because this is the cause of the outrage, and it was the reason protesters wanted the tour to be cancelled. Apartheid was introduced in South Africa in 1948 and was a system of racial segregation in South Africa. This meant that whites and non-whites were kept separate, and non-whites became second-class citizens. In an attempt to end apartheid in South Africa, many countries around the world ended any contact they had with South Africa. However, New Zealand looked over this and still played the Springboks. This made it appear as though New Zealand supported apartheid, and in protest against the New Zealand National Rugby Union's 1976 tour of South Africa, Tanzania led a boycott of 22 African nations in the Montreal Summer Olympics, after the Olympic Committee refused to bar New Zealand from competing. Some of the teams also withdrew after the first day. Even after this, New Zealand continued to play the Springboks, and when the 1981 tour was allowed to go ahead, thousands of anti-apartheid supporters all over New Zealand took to protesting to show their anger. The reliability of this source is questionable, however the mood attached to the source is understandable, as we can see police running onto Invercargill rugby ground. This shows us that there was a need for action and that the police in riot gear were necessary. This source is reliable as it is a primary source, but it is also showing a significant view of what is going on. The photo, however, does not show the reasoning behind the event or the reasoning behind the action being taken. This would cause the reliability of the picture to significantly decrease, as it does not show the entire scene. The second most important cause of the protests was that this was not the first time race had been an issue between these two countries. On multiple tours in 1928, 1949 and 1960 to South Africa, Māoris were excluded from the All Blacks team due to their skin colour. However, on the 1970 tour, Māoris were allowed to go as honorary whites, a situation that appalled Ngāi Tahu leader Frank Winter and others in New Zealand's growing anti-apartheid movement. This is quite a significant cause because when Māori were told they were not allowed to travel to South Africa, there was outrage in New Zealand. It was a huge factor in the growing anti-apartheid protests and New Zealand's first organised nationwide opposition to racist sporting contacts in 1959. When the Football Rugby Union accepted another invitation to send an all-white team to South Africa, the slogan "No Māoris, no tour" became very common, and more than 150,000 New Zealanders signed a petition opposing the tour. This remains one of the largest petitions in the history of New Zealand. Others marched in the streets to voice their opinion. Despite the protests, the tour went ahead. This angered protesters. New Zealand's anti-apartheid movement continued to grow. This had a huge effect on the scale of the 1981 protests because of the size of the anti-apartheid movement had been growing for years. This source highlights the feeling behind the tour. As we can see, the main focus of the article is aimed at "No Māoris, no tour." This source shows us that the Citizens All Blacks Tour Association believed that even in New Zealand and among our own All Blacks there was racial segregation, but this also strongly highlights even more so the outrage that was felt in New Zealand by New Zealanders during this tour. We can see this photo is reliable as it is a newspaper clipping and it comes from a reliable source, the Citizens All Black Tour Association. However, we can also see that this is a reliable source to use and understand what was happening during this time, as it shows the feelings during this time. It does not, however, include specific people. It is giving an opportunity to fight back against racial segregation. This source is outlining that there were in fact a significant amount of people who were willing to fight for what they believed in. This source is a reliable source as it is highlighting a tension that is felt by the average New Zealanders. There is no sign of political involvement from this source. We can purely see a group of people marching to alert others with the issues with the Springboks and the tour, but also how New Zealand and New Zealand population does not agree with the way South Africans treat their people. This photo strongly shows the emotional input into the protests, as we can see there are all different people who are protesting against the tour. This photo does not show the onlookers or where the march is going. This source also does not show if the march was violent or if it was peaceful, with no need for police involvement. So these leave strong questions in the mind of the viewer. The number 3 cause of the uprisings throughout the Springboks tour was the fact that New Zealand Prime Minister at the time, Robert Muldoon, refused to stop sporting clashes between South Africa and New Zealand, saying that politics and sport do not mix. The Commonwealth Heads of State meeting in 1977 discussed the South Africa question and unanimously adopted the Glen Eagles Agreement, promising to discourage contact and competition between their sportsmen and sporting organisations, teams or individuals from South Africa. Despite Glen Eagles, Robert Muldoon made it clear that the government would not allow political interference in sport in any form. The NZRFU took this as a green light and in September 1980 invited the South Africans to tour the following year. When the tour was announced, there were protests throughout the country by the anti-apartheid supporters and the supporters who believed that politics should not be involved in sport. The fourth most significant cause in the protests was the rivalry between Springboks and All Blacks. This is the fourth most significant cause because it wasn't a major cause in starting protests, unlike the other 3 causes. Rather than starting protests and fighting, it only inflamed the level of protests and fighting. The rivalry between Springboks and All Blacks is one of the longest, most enduring between any two sporting nations. In the past, generations of rugby players and enthusiasts from both countries viewed a series victory over the other nation as being the pinnacle of achievement in any sport. This rivalry was a huge factor in allowing the tour to go ahead and the riots that occurred throughout the tour. This was a major cause because of the anti-apartheid supporters tried to stop the matches and it led to fighting between rugby supporters and protesters. This photo shows civilian versus civilian, most likely rugby supporters fighting against anti-apartheid supporters due to anger over games being cancelled. This picture is unreliable as you don't know who is fighting or where the source is from. However, it is a primary source, which makes it more significant. The first consequence of the Springboks tour protests was the physical damage and police trying to control the protests. This was the number one consequence due to the huge amount of people involved in the protests and the huge amount of damage caused by protesters. This had a huge effect on both New Zealanders and the New Zealand economy in the long run. Over the 8 weeks, 2,000 protesters were arrested because of their behaviour. This had a long-term effect on many people due to injuries and the cost of police having to work longer and to repair the damage. The tour cost a great deal to police, and there was also much damage to sporting venues and private property as a result of the clashes between supporters and protesters. Many taxpayers were outraged that they were lumped with the cost of these, while Muldoon's government and the NZRFU appeared to get off scot-free, causing further tension. This is a reliable piece of evidence as it is highlighted as a primary source and shows exactly what happened during the Molesworth Street protests. It also highlights the extreme feelings about the tour and shows the brutality of police to control the protesters. This piece of evidence isn't reliable in the sense that it is factual. However, it is reliable in stating someone's opinion of the Springbok tour but also in highlighting a feeling among a group within society. This photo shows a policeman stating to a citizen that he has not been involved with the marches, but it is their responsibility to pay for the police. While this person believed he is severely unjust, he asked why the NZRFU doesn't pay for it, instead of the taxpayer. However, the cartoon does not show the numbers or facts about the costings, and it also doesn't highlight a significant event. No fighting, just commentary on the tour. The second most significant consequence of the tour protests was that the protests about South African tour were the beginning of the end of apartheid in South Africa. This is highly significant as it was what the protesters had set out to achieve. It is not the number one consequence because of the time it took after the tour for apartheid to collapse. However, it is still very important. Mass protests against the touring Springboks. Protesters invaded the pitch at Hamilton, forcing the cancellation of a game. Some bars and restaurants banned anyone displaying anti-tour badges. People over in South Africa saw images and videos of protesters in New Zealand, and it made them believe they could stand up and fight apartheid. It was the last official apartheid-era Springboks tour. Apartheid in South Africa collapsed in 1991 when they elected Nelson Mandela to lead their country. The new leader acknowledged New Zealand's role in this change. This source is a reliable source as it shows us a significant event and the actions that people were taking during the Springboks tour. This is also a reliable source as it is highlighting these protests in New Zealand, who these protests in New Zealand are for. The black people of South Africa. This is an important source as it is giving significant meaning to the source and adds strength and would accurately bring people to involve themselves in the mobilization of the protest movement against the New Zealand Springboks tour. This photo shows us the basis that will mobilize people into action as it highlights what the protesters are protesting against, fight apartheid, and it shows important detail where these protesters' marches will start and end, so that the information can be widely known and available to the public. This is a form of propaganda as it is enlisting people to march against apartheid. The third significant consequence of the Springboks tour protests was the cancellation of multiple games. This is significant because the protesters actually managed to get 2 games cancelled while South African fans watched. Around 5,000 protesters gathered at Garden Place to march on Rugby Park. Plans had been made to tear down the perimeter fencing and flood the pitch with protesters. Shortly before kick-off, around 350 protesters invaded the pitch. Police formed a cordon around this group, which had linked arms to form a solid block in the middle of the pitch. Police arrested about 50 of them over a period of an hour, but they were becoming increasingly concerned that they could not control the rugby crowd. Fights broke out and objects were hurled at the protesters. The police decided that the situation was getting out of hand and cancelled the match for security reasons. The ground announcement of this decision was greeted with howls of protest and chants of "We want rugby! We want rugby!" This was also the cue for a number of spectators to attack protesters with fists, boots, cans and bottles. The police eventually ushered the protesters from the ground, with enraged spectators lashing out at them. The cancellation of this game was especially significant as it was the first game being broadcast to South Africa and the rest of the world. This source is reliable as it is highlighting a specific event that happened and is showing the measures people went to stop the tour taking place. It was believed, and it is shown here, that police advancing highlights and draws conclusion about who were the violent partakers during the tour, and the protesters are all standing tall and strong and holding their ground while the police are advancing. There is no bias in this source. It highlights the fact that no opinion can come from facts, which makes it reliable as it is a matter of what we see instead of recollection from someone who saw it through their values and their beliefs. The fourth most significant consequence of the Springboks tour was the change in government and the closing down of the South African embassy in New Zealand. In 1984, David Lang of the Labour Party was elected as Prime Minister. This was significant as it put a halt to any future Springboks tour and led to the closing down of the South African embassy. This meant that there were no more protests and attacks. The Springboks tour protests have had huge significance to New Zealand for numerous reasons. The rivalry between Springboks and All Blacks is one of the longest and most enduring between any two sporting nations. In the past, generations of rugby players and enthusiasts from both countries have viewed a series victory over the other as being the pinnacle achievement in the sport. Alongside the history of fierce competition went a tradition of hospitality towards the visiting side. In 1956 and 1965, when South African rugby team toured New Zealand, they were showered with warmth and generosity wherever they went. Yet 25 years later, in 1981 Springboks tour became one of the most remarkable events in New Zealand history. Its impact went far beyond the rugby ground, as communities and families divided and tensions spilled out onto the streets and into the living rooms of the nation. New Zealanders had led comfortable and easy lives, and suddenly for almost everyone and some feeling about the Springboks tour. In a way, the shock and disbelief expressed by New Zealanders at what had happened stemmed from witnessing a loss of innocence. The country had faced social disruption before the 1981 tour, but the 1981 tour brought to the surface arguments of which New Zealand society assumed it was free: racism and bigotry. This was hugely significant, as nothing to this scale had ever happened before. All around the country, families and friends were split due to clashing beliefs and about the Springboks tour and apartheid. As the tour went on and the turmoil increased, the negative feelings intensified to such a degree that feelings like dislike, anger, incomprehension dominated homes all over New Zealand. The All Blacks accepted an invitation to the tour to South Africa in 1976, a time when the world's attention was firmly fixed on the Republic because of the Soweto riots. This is significant because of the time All Blacks decided to travel to South Africa. An All Blacks tour under such conditions was not only intolerable to many New Zealanders, but also attracted international condemnation. Many African nations boycotted the 1976 Montreal Olympics in protest of New Zealand's involvement with South Africa, and the fact that the Olympic Committee refused to ban New Zealand athletes. New Zealand's international reputation had been hugely damaged, but Robert Muldoon still insisted that politics should not get involved with sport, and the 1981 tour went ahead, ignoring the Glen Eagles agreement. At this stage, New Zealand's reputation was at an all-time low.